Stirling Manor rested low in the valley, a grand, rotting edifice of wealth built on exhausted soil and human despair. The air was perpetually close, scented with tobacco leaf and the metallic sweat of labor, a stillness that preceded all storms. For 50 years, the name Stirling had been synonymous with unquestioned power, rooted deep in the southern land and the unbreakable laws of ownership. Adeline, known simply as Addie, moved through the kitchen and dining halls like a ghost in the house she was forced to serve. She was 20, with eyes that held a knowing, ancestral sadness, a trait inherited from her mother, Elizabeth, who carried the deep, silent scars of a life lived under the thumb of the manor's master. Addie's role was to be invisible, yet her presence was the central, unspoken tension of the house. The man who owned them both was Arthur Stirling, the current patriarch, a man whose kindness was as brittle as dry tinder. He was a figure of heavy consequence. His legitimate son, young Elias, already showing the pale, distant cruelty that marked the Stirling lineage. Arthur's interest in Addie was not affection, but a cold, entitled continuation of the power structure, a perverse inheritance of dominion. Their meetings were quick, terrified affairs, always shrouded by the thick, indifferent night or hidden in the shadowy pantry behind shelves of preserves. Addie went because refusal meant a consequence too vast to bear, a horror that would fall not just on her, but on Elizabeth. She carried the terror of the past in her compliance, knowing the cycle of violation that bound her family to the manor's dark will. The day she knew, she carried his child. The familiar weight of the world pressed down until the light seemed to dim and flicker. The secret grew beneath the cloth of her simple dress, a terrifying, biological testament to Arthur's absolute ownership. She told no one, but her mother, Eliza, watched her with an intense, wounded silence, recognizing the familiar shape of a fate she had desperately hoped her daughter would escape. The child came in the spring, a small, quiet boy named James. He was the impossible complication, too fair of skin, with eyes the color of Arthur Stirling's own when he was a youth. The secret was now manifest, a breathing, crying indictment of the house and its master, a piece of the white world born into the black. He was raised in the slave quarters, but his difference was a visible, magnetic tension. Arthur saw the boy and felt a surge of possessive pride, a quiet acknowledgement of his blood that afforded James a margin of protection, a cleaner shirt, a place near the main porch. This slight, terrifying favor made the other slaves avert their eyes. They recognized the dangerous privilege of the master's bastard, an unstable anomaly in the rigid order of the plantation hierarchy. Mrs. Eleanor Stirling, Arthur's wife, was a woman of icy control, her face a mask of social propriety that rarely cracked. Yet, she watched James with a fixed, unnerving intensity, the boy's features slowly aligning in her mind with the portraits of the Stirling ancestors hanging in the gloomy, high-ceilinged parlor. She saw the shape of a truth that undermined her lineage and mocked her decades of cold, sterile duty. The twist began with a fall. James, barely 2, tumbled from the porch steps, cutting his forehead on the stone, and the blood, bright and alarming, drew Arthur from his office in a rare, panicked rush. He knelt, grasping the boy, holding the child of the quarters with an instinctive, protective fury that Eleanor witnessed from the shadows of the doorway, solidifying her terrible, long-held suspicion. Later that evening, in the suffocating quiet of their bedroom, Eleanor presented her husband with the accusation, her voice low and tight with generations of stifled rage. Arthur denied nothing, merely confirming the obvious with a cynical shrug of his heavy shoulders. He spoke of the economic reality, the convenience, the legal right of a master, dismissing the child and Addie as mere property and a tiresome obligation. It was Eliza who delivered the final, crushing blow, the truth that turned suspicion into apocalypse. Summoned by Eleanor for confirmation, Eliza stood before the mistress, her eyes dry and terrifyingly clear. She confessed that James was Arthur S. son by Addie, but then she added the quiet, devastating rider. And Addie is the daughter of Arthur Stirling, sir, the fruit of his first sin against me, 20 years gone. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of generations, the full, cyclical horror of Arthur's depravity laid bare. Eleanor's world did not crumble into tears or hysterics. It solidified into a terrible, granite fury that eclipsed all feeling. Her lineage was not just mocked, it was incestuously, irrevocably stained by the generations of power her husband had selfishly consumed. The true engagement was the moment of quiet. Terrifying realization between Elisa and Addie in the slave cabin later that night. The revelation of the multi-generational truth had done nothing but assure their complete destruction. Arthur would sell them now, or worse, destroy them slowly to preserve his wife's silence. The power structure remained vast and indifferent, demanding their lives as payment for its exposure. Elisa, who had carried the silent weight of Arthur Sterling's lineage in her own blood and then watched it consume her daughter, felt a final, exhausted release. She moved with a strange, "This is Sibe Kama" woman, finally, fully free from the fear that had governed her existence. She knew the time for pleas and passive endurance was over. The answer to such malice could only be fire. She slipped away to the storehouse, the rusty hinges protesting in a quiet screech of warning, and retrieved the oil used for the lamps, a heavy, suffocating kerosene that promised swift, clean destruction. She moved from room to room with the slow, deliberate care of a woman tending a necessary, final chore. She soaked the dry timbers of the back porch, the draperies of the parlor, and the aged, thirsty wood of Arthur's private study, the smell of fuel masking the scent of the coming dawn. Addie watched her mother, clutching James to her chest, the boy's feverish whimpers a counterpoint to the quiet, methodical destruction. She did not question or impede. She understood that this was not revenge, but a necessary amputation of a malignant limb that had consumed their family for too long. They were fleeing not just a man, but the very place that held their history captive. With a final, terrible resolve, Elisa struck the match a tiny, vulnerable spark against the infinite darkness of the night. The flame kissed the oil-soaked silk of the parlor curtain, and with a soft, hungry hiss, the manor, the ultimate symbol of the Sterling curse, began to swallow itself whole. The small fire grew instantly into a voracious, consuming inferno, a sudden, blinding contrast to the quiet, stardusted sky. They fled into the deeper shadows of the field's edge, Elisa leading the way, Addie struggling behind. James' fragile, warm weight against her chest. They heard the sudden, confused shouting from the main house, the frantic, useless cries of those who had slept too deeply in the comfort of their power. The night air was now thick with the scent of pine smoke and the terrible, cleansing roar of the fire. Arthur Sterling, roused by the smoke and the sound of cracking timber, burst from his window only to be met by a wall of impossible heat. He did not call for help. He called for his ledgers, his gold, the material essence of the power he had so ruthlessly amassed. He was caught in the central hall, suffocated by the wealth he died trying to reclaim, the weight of the Sterling structure collapsing down upon the man who had owned them all. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, driven by a perverse, sudden protectiveness, managed to drag young Elias, her legitimate son, from the rising smoke and confusion, leading him half-dressed toward the stables. Her face, illuminated by the hellish glare, was no longer cold, but twisted by a furious despair. The knowledge of her defiled legacy, burning hotter than the house itself. Addie turned one last time, hiding in the dark anonymity of the distant tree line, and watched the Sterling manor crest the distant hill in a monumental, blazing column of defeat. The fire ate through the wood, the guilt, and the generational sin, consuming everything the plantation stood for. It was the only answer that the deep, unforgiving history of the place allowed. They walked away, three shadows slipping into the dense, preyed-on forest, guided by Eliza's grim, steady determination. The sky above them was beginning to pale, streaked with the first false promises of a new day, colored now not by sunlight, but by the distant, orange stain of the inferno they left behind. The last sound they heard was the echoing collapse of the central chimney, the final, earth-shaking surrender of the Sterling manor to the flames. They did not look back. They were simply gone before the dawn broke, carrying the weight of their survival and the child who was the living evidence of the cycle they had violently broken. The damp earth of the forest floor soon gave way to the grasping mud of the valley swamp, the going becoming agonizingly slow. Every footstep was a calculated effort, pulling heavy boots from the thick, sucking clay. Addie stumbled, her arms cramping under the weight of James, whose soft, confused cries she muffled against her shoulder, terrified that the sound would carry back to the ruins. Elisa, meanwhile, seemed imbued with a superhuman, final strength, her older body moving with the grim efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime preparing for this single night. She ignored the tearing branches and the stinking, stagnant water that rose past their ankles. Her focus was entirely forward, driven by the knowledge that the rising sun would bring men, dogs, and the inescapable memory of the manor's rage. Back at the smoking ruin, the scene was one of chaos and stunned disbelief. The surviving slaves huddled away from the intense heat, witnessing the ultimate, violent destruction of their oppressor's throne. When the bodies were finally located, Arthur's remains were identified by the melted signet ring on his hand, crushed beneath a beam in the parlor. Eleanor Sterling stood by the perimeter, her face smeared with soot, watching the final, terrible work of the fire. There were no tears, only a stark, venomous contempt. The shame of the incestuous truth. Not the death of her husband was the wound that demanded blood. The Sterling legacy, she decided, was not to be mourned. It was to be cleansed and rebuilt on an even colder foundation. She turned to Elias, her legitimate son, who stood mute and shaking, the weight of the night having broken whatever weak spirit he possessed. Eleanor gripped his arm, her nails biting into his skin, and commanded him to become the man his father had failed to be: ruthless, immediate, and efficient. The first act of the new patriarch, she dictated, would be to hunt down the runaway property who had dared to expose the family's rot. She gave him the last, loyal houseman, a tracker named Kaito, and promised a reward in land and gold, ensuring his immediate, fervent loyalty. Elias, terrified of his mother's granite will and the future she was forcing upon him, mounted a horse, the scent of smoke and imminent violence guiding him toward the woods, where the three shadows had disappeared. The hunt began, barely an hour after the fire started, a relentless continuation of the manor's malicious power. Meanwhile, Eliza led Addie to a small, hidden cave she had used decades ago, a tight, low recess beneath the roots of an ancient cypress tree, barely large enough for them to collapse into. In the momentary safety, Eliza placed James gently on a bed of dry moss, and finally revealed a long-kept secret. A final resource only now made necessary. She dug beneath the cave floor, pulling out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. It contained not food or water, but a thin leather pouch holding 3 gold coins, and a stiff, yellowed documenta landide. This was the dark twist. A small, forgotten plot of land in a distant, fever-ridden corner of Florida, purchased long ago by Arthur Sterling, intended as a remote, private holding of his own. Elisa explained that she had discovered the deed 30 years prior, hidden among Arthur's earliest papers. Knowing its existence was his secret insurance against any future collapse. It was useless to him now, but to them, it represented a tangible destination, a place where their bloodline might, ironically, hold legal claim to soil, even if that soil was diseased and desolate. Their journey was no longer a desperate flight of survival, but a purposeful march toward a poisoned but potentially free future. They had traded the certainty of death on the plantation for the agonizing possibility of life on Arthur's secret plot. The gold would buy them passage, the deed would anchor their hope, and the fire behind them was the final, irreversible declaration of their break. As the sun finally broke, casting long, accusing shadows through the forest canopy, they emerged from the cave, heading south. The heat of the morning began to rise, and with it, the distant sound of baying hounds carried faintly on the breeze. The new Sterling master was hunting them, but Elisa had given them a target. A small, desolate space on a map where the Sterling name might finally serve their freedom.